Hello, and welcome to our latest episode of 21 Minutes in the Past. I am your new host while the Year 13s are on mocks. I am Isaac, I'm a Year 12 student, and I am joined today by...
Rafi, Milan,
Harley,
and Jacob,
and Charlie.
So, today we will be addressing the issue of the fall of the Tsar, and both the February and October revolutions of 1917 in Russia. We have a series of questions, and why don't we get started? So I think the first one we'll deal with is, what role did long-term structural issues play in the abdication of Nicholas II? So does anybody want to get started with that? Has anybody got anything they'd particularly like to say? Some important backstory, of course, is that Nicholas II was Tsar of all Russia. He was an autocratic leader. And of course he had certain rebellions against him before, like in 1905. He was a weak man, I think everybody can agree, and he was certainly a figure that was divisive in Russian society due to the way that he had conducted himself in his administration. So, on the issue of long-term structural issues.
Yeah, I just think it's important to note that Tsar Nicholas wasn't when he came to power, especially socially, obviously poor living standards in the countryside. Despite the establishment of the land bank in 1883, we know about 80% of the population were peasants when he takes power, which Russian officials refer to as the dark masses. So yeah, it's not a great position that he's taking over, to say the least, to be honest. So I think that's something we should all consider.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think also we have to talk about industrialization too. Industrialization is a really important force for change in Russia, obviously, with urbanization that comes with it, and the effects that can have on things like education and bringing people together, which obviously means that ideas spread more quickly.
Well, yeah, like the more urbanization meant, like in St. Petersburg, the population doubled between 1890 and 1905 from 1 to 2 million, which, yeah, the job pressure obviously increased. Talk of strikes and riots I think you mentioned, could be more easily spread. So although on the surface you could maybe think that the more jobs, the more money, which is a positive thing, Russia just wasn't built for that, and the more people just became more overcrowding. Obviously 80% of the population were peasants, and yeah, that just did not help Nicholas Tsar's situation.
I think we can also talk about the nationalities in the empire, and obviously the fact that despite being a very large and contiguous empire, and that it's all comprehensively part of the Eurasian field, we also can talk about nationalities and being people's different beliefs of what kind of nationality they were. Jacob, do you want to?
Well, I think you have to consider the effect of Russification and how this kind of pushed away minorities and other nationalities from really supporting the leadership. So one thing that the whole Tsarist regime has relied upon, even before we look at Tsar Nicholas, was how censorship and suffering for the people to stop them expanding their views. So things you can look at of how the Ekran'a was used to stifle opposing views, and how news especially was very kept from the top down. So things such as liberal newspapers, such as a famous one called Iskra, was continuously shut down multiple times to try and stop the spreading of new ideas, which was happening more and more with this industrialization and people congesting in these major cities.
Exactly, and unless anyone has anything else to say? No? Then I think we can move on to the next question, which is kind of leading on from this and from what's been said, which is the significance of rapid urbanization, especially in a society like Russia, which has been obviously very agrarian for a very long period of time. And also, I think, importantly, the slight acceptance of Western liberal ideas, not totally, but the acceptance of certain parts of it that might have maybe weakened the autocratic regime, but also contributed to more so to its downfall later on. Does anybody?
We like what some?
Like the fact that we obviously see in 1905 acceptance of certain kind of things like a free press and stuff like that weakens the Tsar's grip on the country, that it's very difficult once people have started forming ideas to get those ideas out of their head, that kind of thing. And did that then lead to the revolution that we saw in 1917? Would it have been a reason for that?
Yeah, I think a big question is, would any figure struggle in the autocratic role, or was it Nicholas himself? Do you think anyone could have succeeded, or do you just think it was the incompetence of Nicholas which actually led to his downfall?
Well, I think that he started industrially, Russia started in such a low position that, in fact, you could argue he's done quite well to, create an average annual growth of 8%. But along with this, obviously, comes all the social problems of poor living conditions, food supply problems, etc.
But obviously, with what you said about 8% growth, we have to also remember that this is often as a result of foreign investment and the reliance that would eventually be developed on foreign loans and subsidies. So maybe it's not all necessarily positive. Charlie, did you?
Yeah, so I was just going to touch on the fact with the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, and I think a lot of the way the people of Russia felt at the time led to the uprisings, and hence why the abdication of Nicholas II was done in this way, due to the feelings of the population, and hence why he was abdicated.
And also, linked to Harley's point, there was, what was it, 8%, did you say?
Annual increase.
Annual increase, but that could have been due to things like they had the grain export policy, which was where they used to sell grain abroad to fund industrial growth, which, probably led to the 8% growth, but then it led to famine and national hunger, which obviously didn't help the abysmal state of the peasant's life anyway. So it was just all about priorities, and I don't think that they got it right with this grain export policy.
I mean, a question that arises from that is obviously the Russian state has been doing this has been doing that same principle of selling grain even when people are starving at home over a long period of history. Do you think there's a reason that at that point it has more of an impact? Is it because of sort of the way that globalization and the way that everyone's getting close together, more newspapers and a free press and stuff like that, or is it just the fact that it was just Nicholas got unlucky?
Well, with the industrialization in the West, maybe they just felt more pressure to kind of get on their level. They were just kind of lagging behind, and maybe they did it more significantly, which led to more significant famine and things like that.
Well, I think another thing that played a factor is people don't realise how unfair that is until this rapid industrialization moves people closer together, and these ideas, well, sort of social revolutionary ideas of we need to be looked after first rather than selling this grain when we're hungry, spread much quicker due to the proximity of the people.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's an important part to recognise. Harley, do you?
So a lot of the growth in industrialization was due to foreign investment, so that they'd have the money to purchase the new machinery and try and catch up with the West. And I think, just a question for anyone, like, where do you draw the line between becoming reliant on foreign investors whilst balancing still, trying to grow your own country?
Well, I mean, that is the question, isn't it? Like, is there a limit to how much foreign investment you can take before it starts to weaken necessarily your own output as a country? Does anybody want to?
I think that's another problem which we're even seeing nowadays, and it's the levels in when we know what the limit is to foreign investment and whether takeovers happen, and we're seeing it even in football clubs such as Newcastle. And it's just the inability to modernise effectively without foreign investors coming in and taking over.
No, exactly. I completely agree. So moving on, unless anyone else has anything incredibly important to say, to what extent do we think was it Nicholas's weakness that was the main cause of the February Revolution? Obviously, there's other things to consider, but was it specifically his weakness that led to it? Yes, Milan.
I think just some kind of background, maybe if anyone else wants to directly answer the question. I just kind of want to touch on, the Tsar's political beliefs, but also his personality and character. So obviously he's very introverted, rarely takes advice from others, very reserved, dislikes confrontation. Kind of maybe this leads to this perception among the Russian people that he's timid or weak. Kind of this timidity may have encouraged revolts, as he appears unsuited. Interestingly, he also, tends to prefer performing silly kind of mundane tasks. For example, marriage policies. I was speaking to Harley earlier about his, just going through letters. I think it's hard to avoid not looking at them things when you consider that overall, vision of him being incompetent.
I think to add on that, I mean, I was actually talking about this earlier to. I faced a lot of disagreement from this. When he went to the front lines and the war and his involvement there, I think that was merely clutching at straws. I don't think that anything good could have come from that. If anything, it made it worse. It made it seem like any failures in the war, you could just put the blame on him, where it didn't need to be put on him initially. But if there was any success, then I don't think it necessarily would have been put on him. He wouldn't have been credited due to the lack of military expertise that he had. I just think that he was kind of clutching at straws to get the kind of reception of Russia.
But speaking about his decision to go to the front lines, do we not think that also, thinking about this as from the perspective of Nicholas, do we not think he saw himself as having almost a duty to go to his people? I mean, the image of a father Tsar is incredibly important to the justification of the Tsar as the autocrat of all Russias. So surely we have to assume that Nicholas sees it not so much as something he wants to do, but as a duty, that he has to go to the front line and he has to do what he can to protect his people. Do you not think that is a reason for him at least to want to go?
Potentially, but then who was replaced in his absence?
Alexander.
Yeah. So and I mean. Which wasn't obviously a very good replacement, was it? So maybe
Putin, of course, as well.
Well, yeah.
Well, I mean, the question is, do we blame Alexandrina for her decisions taken during her time as head of the government while Nicholas was away at the front, or is it more so that she was just persecuted for being a woman? Yeah, Jacob.
Well, I think overall, as you said, this autocrat, the father of Russia, eventually all decisions fall on you, whether they have good outcomes or bad. So whilst it has to be taken into account some of the Tsarina's decisions, such as dismissing respected Duma members, they all reflect on the Tsar as he is the one true rule. So if someone else makes a decision that he is placed there, that reflects him and is still effectively his decision, which is why him going to lead the war may not have necessarily been a bad decision, but his inability to lead on a military standpoint, whilst also leaving an effective rule on the home front, it just cast him in a very bad light.
Yeah. I think importantly, just going back to what you were saying, cause of the 1905 revolution, Russia was definitely, losing to the Japanese was a big embarrassment for Russia. I think it's important to note that, the military incompetence predates the Tsar directly getting involved, on the front lines of the war.
I mean, even in World War II, we see severe defeats, just initially from Russia's entrance to the war in places like Tannenberg.
Yeah.
So it can't just be blamed on the Tsar.
Definitely, that's definitely an important factor. But I think, like Rafi said, once you put yourself in that position, you can't expect not to kind of be scapegoated for all of the army's failures. But yeah, I definitely agree. I think there is kind of an element of duty there, despite his perhaps timid kind of perception from others.
Yeah, totally. And I think in regards to Alexandra as Tsarina in the Tsar's place, I think, do we all agree then that it was the Tsar's fault almost that she had such a negative consequence, as he did willingly choose to leave her in charge, knowing full well that she was both a woman and German, things that would not have been especially conducive to governing well the Russian Empire, which is obviously at war with Germany at the time. Can we all agree that?
Yeah, that's careless.
Yeah, it's a mistake, right? And I think that's reflective of a lot of what Nicholas does. It's a lot of mistakes that, while necessarily aren't malignant, they aren't done with a negative intent behind them. Nonetheless, they have negative effects.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think this kind of can be reflected in Nicholas as a person as a whole, because even from when he became the Tsar, he kind of had this negative idea about whether he wanted to truly do the role. And this can be seen through, he had an early tutor known as Pobyedo Nestyov, who also had a high role in the Holy Synod. and he tutored Nicholas, and a direct quote from him, he said he was well-intentioned but weak, lacking the strength of character necessary to rule. And I think this reflected all throughout this Nicholas's rule as Tsar, because whilst the institution of the autocracy is respected by the people, he himself is seen as weak, and it's merely the Romanov family legacy that's kind of casting him in this great light.
Yeah, totally. And so, talking more about World War One, do we view World War One as the decisive factor in the February Revolution? And I think then we can also ask, do we view World War One as the decisive factor in the October Revolution as well? Is it the war so destructive that it causes the downfall of not just the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty, and the system of Tsarism itself, which has united Russia and governed it for its entire existence, but also the next government that is invented to replace it in the provisional government? Do we think that the war is so destructive to Russian governments that it's to blame not just for one but for both of these?
I mean, to be honest, you can't negate the impacts of World War One on Russia. Like we said, although kind of wasn't the strongest army, obviously, as with any war, severe economic consequences. Importantly, actually, because millions of people were conscripted to the army, there was fewer workers on farms, which kind of resulted in Petrograd receiving only 1/3 of the needed food by 1916. Yeah, I mean, it really is a kind of a horrific consequence on Russia.
But don't you just think that the war just exposed existing weaknesses in Russia already? I mean, the state had an inability to feed the cities, quite literally, manage transport systems, and maintain authority, which just reflected the pre-war incompetence anyway. And another point, probably a less strong point though, other states endured total war without revolution. You've got the likes of Britain, Germany, until 1918. And therefore, the abdication reflects Russia's unique kind of fragility and weakness and vulnerability. I wouldn't say the war alone was the main reason.
Definitely more of a catalyst.
I mean, the only thing about your argument about the other states is that I suppose the difference is that even though places like France and the UK were suffering, there wasn't necessarily that feeling of they were losing as much. In that, for example, Britain was under no threat of being invaded, and so obviously Germany was winning the war. So we have to assume that Russia itself was facing a totally different set of circumstances, in that they were facing a war that they were not only losing but losing badly. I mean, Charlie, did you want to?
Yeah, I just thought I'd add that, I mean, the effect of World War One and Russia obviously exposed the incompetence of the political regime. But just to add, apart from political, I think we also need to look at the social and economic effects. And socially, there was obviously the amount of deaths that left families in Russia, obviously absolutely torn apart. And then there was 1.7 million military deaths, and economically, the inflation after and during the war had risen by, I think by early 1917, inflation had risen by over 300% compared to 1914.
Wow.
And therefore just showing the widespread effects, not just politically but socially and economically.
I mean, the only thing with that though is if we say that it's stuff like the deaths that Russia was facing, can we really assume that it was that when we consider the fact that only 20 or so years later, Russia, the Soviet Union, fought a war where 27 million Russians died? So can we assume that the loss of 1.7 million people is enough to truly bring down the regime if it's not already existing issues that the regime has, when we have the example of the Second World War where so much more is endured by the people of Russia? Yeah, Jacob?
Well, I agree to that partly, but to build on what Rafi said, the act of the First World War meant that other problems went almost unopposed in Russia. So whilst there were 1.7 million deaths, there were also 7 million casualties by the start of 1917. And what this meant was a lot of Russian men were suffering by the hands of the Tsar, who had taken control. And whilst this was happening, while Russian people were getting injured and losing their lives, things such as increased inflation, but also the overarching land problems that Russia had faced for the Tsar's entire rule. So back in mainland Russia, peasants were land grabbing and taking villages themselves over the issue while they're all being poor as peasants. Sorry. While they're struggling to buy this food now, it's gone up 300%, that wages can't match, and they're having to resort to crime to try and live. And this is kind of just going unopposed. So whilst the war was a key problem, it was more, it diverted all attention from the ongoing problems that had existed in Russia.
Agreed. And I think now I'm going to be a bit mean and surprise you all with a question that wasn't on the email I sent out. So I'd like to ask, and anybody can answer if you want to. Do we think that Nicholas's downfall was inevitable from the moment of his accession to the throne, or do we think it was something that he could have avoided at any point during his reign? Yeah.
I think it was inevitable, as going into the reign, he kind of already had inherited these very autocratic, almost arrogant views from his father, and he felt that it was his duty to kind of follow these, to like carry the family legacy, and he also felt religiously as well that it was his divine right to be the king, and this led to him not allowing people to help him in his rule. And I think that actually maybe was why he appointed Tsarina to take command of the country whilst he went to war. She might have been one of the only people that he thought wouldn't possibly take power over him and go against his autocratic rule.
Yeah, I agree actually. I think that the key thing there that you said was that the autocratic beliefs left him unable to adapt to a rapidly modernising Russia. I think that's the key thing there, not listening to advisors, resisting political reform, mishandling industrial unrest, all the other structural problems that I think some of us have touched on meant the regime was already fragile. But I do think that the kind of, the revolution and even the First World War really did expose his incompetence. That combined with obviously the personal decisions that we've touched on, I think really do mean that his downfall was inevitable.
Any final comments from anybody on anything about the Tsar's downfall? No. Well, thank you all for listening to our slightly longer than 21 minutes in the past, and we hope you have enjoyed with our almost entirely new cast of people. So we will be back soon, hopefully, with an episode about the 1979 revolution in Iran. And we hope that you have enjoyed. Thank you very much for listening.